Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Q&A with On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, author Ocean Vuong. I'm Joe Piedrafite, Regional Alumni Officer with the Department of Alumni Relations at UMass Amherst. A couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started tonight. This event is being recorded and will be available for viewing at a later date. By participating in this event, you are giving consent to be part of a recorded session. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A option available. Please feel free to post any questions during the webinar, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible. And finally, the chat function will not be available, and participants' cameras and microphones will be disabled throughout the event. And now I'd like to introduce Barbara Krathammer, Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts.
Good evening. Thank you, Joe. Robert L. Lynch is President and CEO of Americans for the Arts and its membership of 7,000 arts agencies and professionals, as well as the Americans for the Arts Action Fund with 400,000 citizen activists. With over 44 years of experience in the arts industry, he is motivated by a personal mission to empower communities and leaders to advance the arts in society. Under his direction, Americans for the Arts has become a leader in documenting and articulating the key community development role played by the nonprofit arts and culture industry and its audiences in strengthening our nation's economy. Mr. Lynch has also been instrumental in creating a strong portfolio of projects and information about the transformative power of the arts in non-arts areas, such as civic dialogue, social problem solving, and arts and healing in the military. Mr. Lynch currently serves on the board of the American Craft Council and the Commission on the Arts of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has served 2 terms on the board of the Independent Sector and 2 terms on the U.S. Travel and Tourism Advisory Board, a position appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. In 2017, he was the inaugural recipient of the JFK Commonwealth Award from the Massachusetts Cultural Council and the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. In 2014, he was awarded the Sidney R. Yates Award for Outstanding Advocacy on behalf of the performing arts. And he was selected as one of the 50 most influential executives in the nonprofit sector for 5 years, 2012 through 2014, 2018, and 2019, as part of the Nonprofit Times Power and Influence Top 50. Mr. Lynch is a frequent press commentator in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Chronicle of Philanthropy, and on National Public Radio and CNN, as well as many social media outlets. Mr. Lynch earned a BA in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he enjoys playing piano, mandolin, and guitar. Bob lives in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Bob.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
And so now I'd like to introduce Ocean Vuong. Ocean is the author of the New York Times best-selling novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, published in 2019 by Penguin Press, with forthcoming editions in 30 languages. A recipient of the 2019 MacArthur Genius Grant, he is also the author of the critically acclaimed poetry collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, which was a New York Times Top 10 book of 2016, and also the winner of the T.S. Eliot Prize, the Whiting Award, the Tom Gunn Award, and the Forward Prize for the Best First Collection. Ocean's other honors include the Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Fellowship, awarded by the Poetry Foundation, as well as numerous fellowships and awards from the Lannan Foundation, the Civitella Ranieri Foundation, the Elizabeth George Foundation, the American Academy of Poets, and the Pushcart Prize. Vuong's writings have been featured in The Atlantic, Granta, Harper's, The Nation, New Republic, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Village Voice, and American Poetry Review, which awarded him the Stanley Kunitz Prize for Younger Poets. Ocean was selected in 2016 by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the 100 leading global thinkers. He was also named by BuzzFeed Books as one of 32 essential Asian American writers. Ocean has been profiled in NPR's All Things Considered, the PBS NewsHour, Teen Vogue, Interview, Poets and Writers, and The New Yorker. Born in Saigon, Vietnam, he lives in Northampton, Massachusetts, and we're so pleased is associate professor in the MFA program for poets and writers at UMass Amherst. Welcome, Ocean.
So I think I'll just jump in. It's my honor to have the opportunity to do some questions and answers tonight. But I want to first thank the Dean very much for her generous introduction. And it is really great to be here with our wonderful guest, Ocean Vuong. We've received some pretty great questions already, and I'd like to get ahead or go ahead and get started. But first, Ocean, let me add my own personal welcome to you and to all of our guests tonight, and also a thanks. Thanks for being here, but also thanks for your work. I want to celebrate first, if I could, your magnificent prose and poetry. These books, the poetry and the fiction, are beautiful pieces of literature. They are beautiful despite some tough topics that we have some questions about. Difficult subjects like family complexity or first love or race, and was even described in one of the reviews I read as brutally honest exploration. These books, though, are also full of gorgeous language on every page. Every paragraph in the book, to me, is a poem, which doesn't surprise people from a poet, I imagine, but they're just beautiful. And I remember when I actually purchased On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, the salesperson could not stop talking about you. She was unable to stop talking about the work and how much she loved it. And I kept saying, well, you know, time for me to go, or looks like the sun is setting. I finally got out of there, but it made an impact on me. So then I read the book with great relish after that. So the first question that I have is one that has to do with family. You've written so much about members of your family, from your mother to your grandmother, uncles, and so on. Very rich stories. Can you tell us about your family and also how the tradition of storytelling in your family has informed your writing?
Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Dean Kraulheimer. Welcome to HFA. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really proud to represent this public institution. You know, I'm a product of public schools from kindergarten all the way to my BA. I started at Manchester Community College down the road here. It's been a very enriching journey to come back to New England after spending 11 years in New York, and to teach here and to make a life here, and to ultimately write and create works here. It's fertile ground, you know, as we all know, for literature. And as far as storytelling, you know, I always think of the German philosopher Walter Benjamin essay on Nikolai Leskov. It's an essay sort of glorifying this very obscure writer, Russian writer, Leskov. But on his way to doing that, Benjamin sort of has this incredible defense and exposition about the difference between storytelling as an archaic tradition and the novel, which he says comes out of a middle-class milieu, that comes out of the printing press. which ultimately privatizes the act of reading. But Benjamin says that storytelling is a work of labor. It is the tradition that all civilizations have come forth, and it comes out of labor. And this was so important to me because the women who raised me work in nail salons, they worked in factories, they worked in the homes. The house was always a factory of work. When you become immigrants from being refugees in a new country, you realize that time and work was so precious that everything had to be done while something else was done. And I thought it was so unique, it was so special. But when I was reading Benjamin's essay, he says, this is actually the foundation of storytelling. This is what the national myths come out of. They come out of when the blacksmith has to go from village to village, sets down her tools, and starts to tell a story while everyone's waiting for work to be done. And what happens in this laborious tradition of storytelling is the body is always present. And the speaker is always commenting on the story being told, what they think about it. Do they believe it? They always pause. So the self is always interfering with the story. When the printing press came about, the novel became sort of this bourgeois artifact where labor was now removed and reading became privatized. And so the trajectory of the novel, authors started to follow and adhere to those standards. And then so you have the novels where we end up in the glory, the golden age of the novel, which is the 19th century, where it was about sprawling families, right? Often from the aristocratic families. And so for me, it was so interesting to me to bring back the storytelling tradition to labor, and in this case, the labor of Vietnamese American women.
Oh. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you has to do with the women who raised you that you referenced, and it actually has to do with your mother. At the very beginning of your book, your dedication page says, "For my mother." I know that she passed this past year, so sorry for that. But I was curious about the fact that, I know she came to a reading or two or more. I don't know. I'd love to know what that was like. And, I noticed in another review when you were speaking at the second annual Asian American Literature Festival in August of 2019, the review said that the moment that we were all waiting for was Ocean reading from his debut novel. But what brought the house down was when he introduced his mother. So if you could talk a little bit about what it was like to have her hear your reading of the novel or the poetry.
Yeah, I think it's, any mother is proud when their child achieves something, of significance. A book relative to the rest of the world is a small thing, but it's big for a mother who did not have the education that I was given. And so I think for her, it was proof that her sacrifices paid up to something. And it was, I'm uneasy with the notion of the American dream, this sort of golden, white picket fence promise. But it's not nothing, right? And it changes depending on who you are. So my mother's dream was never to have a white picket fence and a house. It was just to see that the people, her children, her sons, she has two sons, myself and my brother, made a life that was easier than hers. It's our most primal desire as a species. And she loved to actually turn away from me when she would go because she wanted to see how my words were affecting the people's faces in the audience. So she would kind of sit, adjacent to me and turn to the audience. She said, I want to see, how they're reacting. That was her spectacle. And so it was a wonderful experience. You know, a lot of folks, a lot of immigrants, you know, make it, quote unquote, without their parents seeing. I have friends who finally become professors. You know, I have a friend who's a Mexican immigrant whose parents were fruit laborers in California, and they passed away before he became, you know, the chair of his English department. And, you know, I was very, very fortunate for my mother to see towards the last year of her life that some of my successes, and I got to share that with her. And it's one of my most precious moments, was to be able to stand up in that stage with her and to have people celebrate her. You know, it's that labor that I talked about in the beginning, that led to something, right? That led to literature. It didn't start with me. It started with the labor of these women who couldn't read.
You know, I think that that honoring of that legacy and those women who did all of that work is one of the things that I've been very struck by. And you do it again and again in your comments and in your work. And it is in some ways a lost aspect in our American landscape, that we do stand on the shoulders of so many other people. Now, on the other hand, my mother, who's 96, still comes to some of the things that I do, and I kind of wish she would turn away, because she's looking at me either frowning or smiling or giving me signals that I find a little distracting. But one of the things, because the topics in this book are so important and challenging themselves, I was wondering, what were some of the challenges to you in writing this book? Emotionally, was it emotionally painful to revisit so many of these memories, or maybe it was therapeutic? Or how did you deal with those subjects?
Well, I think my approach to literature is first and foremost as an artist, and I think my project, my lifelong project, I suppose, is to turn the contexts that are familiar to me into a sort of simulation amplified by the imagination. And so, you know, I told myself that if I wrote this book and it looks too much like my life, if it looks too much like a memoir, there would be no reason to do it for me. There are plenty of great memoirists, there's plenty of great documentarians, but I think ultimately I don't write memoir and I don't make a documentary, and I never will, because I think at the core of it, I'm interested in the simulation. I'm interested in putting characters that have the context that are recognizable to me in the American context. These group of refugees, you know, working in working class New England, and seeing how they thrive. And I think asking of them questions, I think ultimately I am too cowardly to ask of my own kin. You know, I'm someone who, if I were to ask these hard questions of my family, I think I would be sobbing, or they would be sobbing within a minute, you know. And so I, maybe the ultimate reason why I write fiction and poetry is because I'm a coward at heart. But I hope that the interest in readers and in shares would be shared with myself, which is that I want to bring these characters into a parallel universe and see where these things happen, because the magic of fiction is that a character like Little Dog is actually much better than I am. He's much more considered. He in fact has 12 drafts, whereas Ocean Vuong only has one draft at life. And so I think the technology of a novel is that it is somebody's best effort at looking at the world. And this is what I tell my students. I said, here's your chance. The more drafts you have, the more of yourself in the room. Why would you want to write as an individual only when you can write as 12 oceans or 30 oceans, right? You can have more of yourself. And drafting towards literature is ultimately an act of care. We are caring for tiny objects. And even if you don't have ambitions to be a quote unquote writer, the practice of writing well, I think, is incredibly important for anyone at any age, but especially at the collegiate level, because you're teaching students to really be meticulous about probably life's smallest objects next to maybe the molecule. And so I think that context was important to me. And I knew that I had to change it. To me, the test of literature is transformation. If it ends up the same at the end, I would never publish it. And so to answer your question in an elongated way, it was hard, sure. You know, novelists will tell you, even if they're writing about Mars, they'll get emotional because the characters are so dear to them. But it wasn't so close to my life that I felt any particular way about it. Other than that, you know, the simulation was worth it ultimately.
You know, I'm struck by your phrase that I am a coward at heart, because what you reveal in the book and how you've tackled so many subjects is, to me, very, very brave. But that I am a coward at heart might be, we could spend the rest of the time talking about that as an impetus for all of literature. Maybe there's another book there. But what I want to say that relates to that is you have described in your writing some vulnerabilities, and you've talked about some very tough incidents in your earlier life that you yourself faced. So did you feel vulnerable when publishing your novel? Did you receive any backlash about the content because it is so brave?
No, I mean, I think I'm really lucky that I'm writing in 2019, you know, particularly in the American tradition. It's hard to go more scandalous and more fraught than Lolita. And, you know, to go all the way back to Whitman, the first depiction in the English language of Adam and Eve copulating. You know, and so I think I'm very lucky in that I got to participate in a literary tradition that is akin to rock and roll. You know, we've kind of done it all. It's well trodden ground, and I think the inspiration there is that anything was possible. And I think if there is ever an American dream, for me, it is more an idea and more of a promise of that freedom. To participate in a literary tradition where freedom of speech created probably some of the finest literature that we've seen. And that is incredibly inspiring to me, to engage with that, to take from it and to forge hopefully something new out of that tradition.
You know, I loved your poetry before I loved your fiction, and you know, the poetry book that you did has some wonderful things that are my favorites. Someday I'll Love Ocean Vuong is one of those, and then you even wrote a poem with the same title as your book in there, which shows a wonderful lineage, I guess. But I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the process for you of writing, and also, I guess, the parallel process of publishing a novel, as somebody whose previous focus has been poetry.
Yeah, yeah. I think, you know, if we go back farther enough, we see that the genre borders collapsed quite quickly in, you know, in literary history. I mean, is the Iliad a poem? Yes, it was memorized and performed as such, but it's also a great epic novel. And some of our best practitioners of either art, James Baldwin, Joyce Carol Oates, Dennis Johnson, Thomas Hardy, Melville, who lives up in Berkeley, in the Berkshires, as we know, wrote more lines of poetry than Dickinson and Whitman combined. And so I think, again, I think I just, to be, this is why I tell my students, like, if you want to write well, be a scholar of literature. Master your field, right? A rocket scientist or bioengineer would study every formula all the way back to Einstein and beyond. And if you're a writer in the English tradition, as we are, study all of the English texts and then some, right? And the problematics therein. And so for me, it was the permission was always granted through reading first. And I think that's reading to me, and active reading is an incredibly important part of my own education and the pedagogy that I try to instill in the students here.
So I'd love to talk a bit about the pedagogy. My UMass English department and the professors that I had,
Was that Bartlett Hall back in that? I heard about
back in the Bartlett Hall days. Yes,
I came just when they kind of like shut it down. I heard it was, you know, it was rough at the end of its life, a glorious life.
it had a glorious life. A lot of good stuff happened. But when we didn't want it rough, I was saying to the folks at the alumni office earlier, we'd walk across to Memorial Hall where they had these leather seats and rugs, and we'd do our writing there. But what I want to say was that those professors who I had were critical to what I am today. And I'm not focusing on being a poet or focusing on being a writer, although that is still part of my work, as it is probably for most English majors when they graduate. Poetry and creative writing is the basis for how I think and how I advocate, which is my work, to advocate for the arts in America. So wondering if, as a teacher, and by the way, even though I'm more than twice your age, I would have loved to have you as one of my professors. But can you talk a little bit about your teaching practice and how you create spaces where emerging writers are willing to take the risks similar that you've taken? And are there certain rituals that you can share about your work, your writing?
Yeah. I you know, for me, it begins with intention. What is the intention? What was it that made you sacrifice so much? All of our students sacrifice so much to get here. They leave their homes in the middle of the country. They pick up their lives in just a few bags, and then they plant it, and they say, I'm going to be a writer. That's you know, some would say that's quite insane to do that, right? And to do it in a life where it's not economically necessarily promising. And so I began my pedagogy with the largest question possible, which is, why are you here and how do we keep you here? And I don't mean keep you here in UMass, although the walls are quite strong, in our beautiful new building, I must say, in South College, but keep you here on the page. How do we keep you in the field? Because the writing field is not kind. We live in a culture that, you know, the liberal arts are the first to always be cut, right? It seems extraneous. It's always seen as sort of decadent, and the fields and the careers are, you know, very scarce and difficult to come by. And so I think I tried to honor that. And for me, the answer is very clear. Is that storytelling, and whether you're doing poetry or fiction or prose or journalism, you're participating in storytelling. That is using language to transform and manipulate meaning within a subject, right? There are subjects that arise in the world, and language maps itself onto the subject and casts through rhetoric meaning. That happens everywhere. Turn on your TV, and every 30 seconds you'll see an ad about, you know, using storytelling to get you to do something. In this election cycle, right? What's the story? Every news article. And so to me, storytelling is actually an advanced technology in our species. But when we think about liberal arts and English departments and philosophy, we think, oh, these are just folks, you know, meditating. We need the essentials. We need the stems, the bioengineering, the medicines. And I think there is much caution to be had about a culture and a nation that starts to privilege what I call the essentials, to see the essentials: medicine, food, science, agriculture. It's akin to me, in a not so hyperbolic way, of a family no longer buying books, but buying canned goods, water, you know, electric generators, right? We're preparing, in other words, for disaster. So my assessment as a professor in the past 4 years traveling across the country, teaching and doing lectures from Ivy League colleges to high schools, I've seen this retraction of this fear, and it tells me that something is afoot in our country, that we're heading towards that sort of apocalyptic thinking. Meanwhile, if you look at the Fortune 500 companies and the companies in Silicon Valley, they're obsessed with storytelling because no technology is useful or activated until there is a story to activate it. Right? That's what they're interested in. So a lot of my peers would once in a while teach a class or two at Google and Amazon. Why? Why are these folks who you would never think would be interested in the liberal arts are learning storytelling? Because they need to know how to make and sell their technologies using a narrative. And we see this in the militarization on the dark side of things, right? Often we think of literature as a key to empathy, but literature and storytelling could also be quite dark in the wrong hands, lest we forget Adolf Hitler, first and foremost, was an author, right? Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, all of those. And one thing that was really struck me when I think about the storytelling place in our world is the firing rate of soldiers in World War II, roughly from 20 to 25%. And if you are a military industrial complex, that's a failed system. Your weapon is jamming technically, if only a quarter of your men are shooting. And so the American military really brainstormed and said, how do we fix that after World War II? It was a big problem. It wasn't that big of a problem during Civil War because that was a mechanical problem. The guns simply might not have fired well. But during World War II, the guns were firing well, but men did not shoot them. By the time we got to Vietnam, the conflict in which I owe so much of my life and so much of my research, that firing rate went up to 90%. What happened? The military figured out that you had to change the story. And so a psychological operation was instilled into basic training where racial slurs were implemented into how the enemy are seen, with words like chink and gook, right? In other words, a system of storytelling was put in place so these young men drafted to fight and to kill saw people of another country as less than human, to dehumanize. Again, we talk about language, mapping on a subject and transforming that subject into something else. If that is not advanced technology, I don't know what is. And so that has been always implemented. And so I tell my students, I commemorate you because they tell you that what you're doing won't get you a job. They tell you that this is decadent. They tell you that the liberal arts are failing and crumbling, bottom of the rung of hierarchy. Meanwhile, they're doing it, but they're doing it behind closed doors. They're doing it. They're using the same skills to run their campaigns, to run their ads, to sell their products. You're brave because you're doing it in the open. You're doing it under the mantle of poet and writer. But meanwhile, they're doing the same thing, right? So I think what they're doing is actually incredibly important. A society and a nation needs to know how to tell its story well. And I think a president that we have now is the symptom of leaving that muscle to atrophy, to let the storytelling fall on the wayside and have others control the narrative, right? Now we have what we call fake news, comes right out of it. And all of this begins, to me, with the poem, because it is the most microscopic unit of language that we have. On the syllabic level, if you could master your language on a syllabic level, you can tell any story you want. And trust me when I say your life depends on how you tell the story.
I think as you bring up the current election, that we're seeing a massive play out of alternative stories happening, different approaches to the same reality told radically differently. And the actual storytelling of it is the skill that, as very much as the storytelling is critically important. You know, related to that, I was very pleased to see Vice President Biden reference how he used Yeats's poetry and Emerson's poetry to help heal.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
So, but with that, let me just say that I'm curious because in addition to the story and the narrative and the poetry and the writing, there's also similar uses of music and theater and other art forms. Does music or other art forms influence or inspire your writing? Is it a tool that is part of your portfolio?
Absolutely. I think music particularly because it's a democratic sonic weather, right? Everyone, whether you know the lyrics, whether you're an English speaker or not, can experience music in an incredibly idiosyncratic and true way, according to them. And yet it's the same notes, right? If you're walking through a space, music interrupts you and it becomes a sonic weather. And so I'm really interested in having a controlled medium, that is music, in a space, and to see how characters interact and see how that medium changes them, right? That's the most exciting thing, is to see how a character interacts to the same thing. Andy Warhol talks about his love for Coca-Cola, right? Because he says for the first time, you know, the Queen of England and the guy down the street are experiencing the same thing. They're experiencing down to the exact chemical, right, ratio. They're experiencing the same thing, right? So it's really interesting. You know, there's the sugar industry and all that involved with it that's destroying our health. But Warhol was really excited about this concept of an egalitarian medium. And I think music perhaps is a healthier one.
The as a Diet Coke addict, I appreciated your comments about Andy and his love of Coke. I have so many other questions that I want to ask, but I want to pause for a second because Joe has been monitoring any questions that might be coming in. And Joe, are there any questions that you have for Ocean at this moment?
Nope, they've all kind of been sort of, we've kind of answered them in sort of different ways. So we're good to go.
Great. So I'll go to the ones that I'm curious about, and many of them. But one, you've talked about Melville, and I know in the past I've seen you reference William Carlos Williams and many contemporary writers. Is there somebody besides family from your past, either in your past or a writer or an artist, any artist who is particularly inspiring for your work today?
A few. I think to me it was my ESL teachers in elementary school, Mrs. Callahan and Mrs. O'Rourke. I don't know why they were all Irish, but they were great. They were, you know, I think they showed me what could happen when you slow down, when education becomes a process of depth rather than quantity. And so I still take that practice. You know, I'm known in the MFA to have some of the slowest moving classes, right? Some of my students, if they're here tonight, they'll attest to this. You know, we probably read maybe 3 poems in 3 hours, but we never, we don't, you know, there's so much to say. And every work, I think, of literature is the DNA, it's the thumbprint of a mind, right? Every individual has a thumbprint. But language is a thumbprint of the personhood made shareable, and experience. And so I think there's so much depth there. And I learned how to teach that way from these early ESL teachers. They let me slow down. You know, it wasn't even about finishing the book. It was about putting your hand on one word at a time and seeing those words as objects, as malleable, movable objects. And I owe a great debt to them.
So we are just almost at the end of our time, and but I'd like to sneak in one more question if I could. By the way, as a Lynch, I was very happy that a Callahan and an O'Rourke were so helpful along the way in your journey. The times that we're in right now, your work talks about survival and violence, and that's something that we're needing to deal with even more these days. But what I'm curious about is what role you see for the arts in the ways that this nation might come together now and in the future. And a second part of that is you also use the word transformative. The transformative power of the arts, what does that mean, and how do we harness the arts right now in this time in America?
Yeah, I think we have to remember that arts are tools, and they're magical tools, and they could be used for black magic and white magic. You know, we've seen rhetoric. You know, like again, the Holocaust began with speeches, right? It began with speeches. It begins with a book, right? And every horrific page in our human history begins with art. We rarely say that, but I think it's important. I think it's important to see art as such a potent potential for a nation, and we have to participate in wielding it better, because if we don't, someone else will. And I think it's even more pressing now because we're in a pandemic, right? There's so many layers of struggle and constriction, you know, even in an MFA as ours, which is a storied MFA. We were going on our 55th year here, second only to Iowa. And, you know, Iowa is a World UNESCO Heritage Site for literature, but it doesn't really have a, you know, a historical legacy outside of the MFA. And I would argue, and a lot of folks, you know, in our MFA and in our community would say, well, there's no reason Amherst in the Pioneer Valley should also be a World Heritage Site. You know, we're living in the shadow of the greatest woman writer, the greatest poet, perhaps, in American history, Emily Dickinson. The beginning of modernism began with her, writing at the time where the country was literally falling apart. And I try to think of that and remember that, you know, and I feel really proud to participate as an educator, not only in this field, but particularly at the school and in this program, in this part of our country, you know. But we're up against an uphill battle, you know. The president has cut the National Endowment of the Arts every year since he's been in office, and the pandemic and the virus has really hampered and constricted, you know, our department even. You know, for the first time in our history of nearly half a century, we will not be having a woman teaching poetry in a permanent faculty for the first time since 1985. And there's no immediate plans to have that happen. And I think despite the great hope I have, you know, everything I've said tonight and everything that we shared together, that's the reality. That's the wall we're up to. Nobody expected a pandemic would come. And here we are, you know, we are in the namesake, the ground of Emily Dickinson. To me, as a poet, which is holy ground to me, one of our most courageous writers. And we really, and we don't have a woman to carry that tradition, you know, here. And so I hope we can look towards that future and to bring that forth and to continue to enrich and meet the diversifying needs of our students. Our students are majority, proudly we say, the majority of our students are gender nonconforming and identify as women. But there's so many things up against it. But we have to remember that the arts are not just there to you know, to make us feel good. It's not just where we have we work and then we pick up a book to relax. If we don't tend to it and protect it and wield it, someone else will use that technology, because it is technology, and they will use it to send our brightest and brilliant people to war and to be destroyed in war, as evidenced by history. And so the only thing I would say is see it as something up for grabs. And it needs to be up for grabs. And the more funding we have, the more we can tend to it and care for it so that it doesn't fall into bad hands, which I think is already happening in so much of the world.
Powerfully said. And it occurs to me that I should have explained at the beginning that the poster up behind me, which says Arts Vote, basically that's the work, that's part of the work that we do, leading advocacy efforts for the arts and for arts organizations that support the arts in America, and getting the vote out for pro-arts candidates at the federal, state, and local level is the answer to what you're talking about. Ocean, thank you for a wonderful discussion, and Dean Krauthammer for joining us, and for everybody else who has joined us and still with us. We appreciate all of you for making the time to join us here today and bringing in so many good questions. And we look forward to seeing you at other Alumni Association, MFA, and HFA events soon. And as a reminder, the next book in the Read UMass series is the book called So You Want to Talk About Race. Begins October 15th. And you can learn more and register today at umassalumni.com/events. Thank you all again. Thank you again, Ocean.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.